Welcome to The Pain and the Promise. This is the fourth in the Merry Musing series. And this time we're going to go into a kind of look at our civilizational development and what I see as a key moment, a key transition that we made, and a key trauma that we experienced at that point in time that has really deeply influenced the future of our civilization and the place that we are now in terms of the deep ecological and social challenges before us. So to start with, just to bring this issue up, and we'll see why in a second, that one of the things that I realized not long ago was how the linearity of the way we see ourselves and our development is actually at the core of the challenge that we're facing right now. And as I looked into that, I realized that linear time itself is actually quite a recent phenomena in terms of the way we see ourselves. So we spent 3 million years as hunter-gatherers where we didn't experience time as linear at all. We experienced it as secular and very much in the moment. So this concept of past, present, future in a kind of linear trajectory is actually quite a recent way of seeing things in human development. And not many people realize that. And when you do stop and think about it, it makes you question the way you experience and see and understand the world, because we're all used to assuming in a way that linear development is a kind of given of the universe. Well, it's not a given of the universe. There's actually a perspective that we have adopted at a certain point in time. And this is important because it relates to how our apparent past is related to our potential future. And that is where the healing of this split that I'm going to talk about is so important. So one of the things that made me question this whole linearity were images like this, which is this weird kind of realization that humans seem to be exactly halfway on the scale between the big scale of things and the tiny scale of things. As Laszlo and Caravan say, literally midway on the scale between the nuclear and the galactic. So is that just coincidence? It doesn't feel like it is to me. It feels like it's something to do with our perspective, and that as we see bigger, we also see smaller, or vice versa. As we see smaller, we also see bigger. That it's not that somehow we're at our perspective on things is determining how big a picture and how small a picture we can see, and that those two actually go hand in hand. So that spatial size also goes hand in hand with the idea of a linearity of time and space. So past and future, my theses seem to be connected in the same way that it seems like our relationship to space is in terms of big and small. So that was another thing that made me question this whole linear perspective on time. And particularly through the energetic work that I've been doing, one of the things I've realized is that each time we as individuals or as collectives in our organizations want to take a leap in our development, a step forward, there's nearly always some trauma or pain locked in our past that is preventing us from taking that step forward. And in order to be able to take that step forward, we have to dig down and reconnect to and reintegrate that energy that is held in our past due to some kind of past trauma or pain. Just like a tree is the metaphor I'll often use, where, if a tree wants to send its branches higher into the sky, it has to send its roots deeper or else it'll fall over. So when a seed grows, it doesn't grow just up like this. It actually, out of the top comes the plant and the leaves and the shoots and things. Out of the bottom come the roots. So a seed grows like this. It doesn't grow just linearly up like this. It grows in both directions in a way that's where they're related, which is why I've integrated this image here of the tree with the torus, which for me represents the most accurate way of understanding the way life and organic life forms work. So this is an image from eco-intention, which is part of the energetic work that I do. And here you can see a graphic representation of a time wave, as we would call it. So how, let's say you have your future comes into this funnel and is coming into form, and then the patterns that are created then go back out into the field as your past. They're kind of recorded, as it were, in the information fields as your past. And unless you transform that pattern by revisiting it in some way, it just comes back round again into your possible future and drops into your present. So the things we do in the present influence our past, which then come back and influence our future. So they're deeply interconnected with each other, both future and past, in a way which our linear evolutionary perspective and explanation of time often doesn't do justice to. So there's the same pattern as with the tree. Now, in evolution theory, and I'm not going to go into the details of that this time, that'll be the subject of the next Merry Musing session. One of the things I look at is these dynamics, where essentially you've got a creative tension between a seed in the present moment and a potential future. And in order to be able to expand one's freedom into greater consciousness, one has to integrate one's past to be able to release that energy. And I depicted it in these stages. So at some point we have an impulse to grow, an impulse to take a next step in our development. As we reach up into that possible future, we bring in more light or more consciousness. We're trying to expand our awareness. That light comes in, and as the light comes in, it enlightens the shadow. So the brighter the light, the clearer the shadow. And so we stretch up, we open up to more, we bring in more light, and that light reveals the shadow of past trauma and pain. If we work with that, we then integrate that traumatic experience or that pain. That releases the energy that we need to be able to take the next step forward in our growth. So this concept, in a way, lies behind what I see as being the key challenge, actually, the essential challenge for humanity at the moment, is that there is a trauma in our collective past that is holding us back in our collective evolution. And the stress that we're in now in terms of our ecological crises and our social crises and our health crises are directly related to our ability to be able to heal that split and heal that pain, to release the information and energy we need to be able to take the next step. So to pick one map of human development over time, this comes out of the spiral dynamics model, 8 phases of development in a linear time perspective from the bottom up towards the top. They are phases of development that we go through as individuals and collectives. And when this model was first developed, it was really seen very much like in the developmental psychology models as being you go through a kind of stage at a time in your development here. And that you kind of move from one to the next to the next. In a healthy development, you transcend and you include the previous stage as you move ahead. Now, I'd been very familiar with this model, and at some point I started feeling uneasy with the linearity of the perspective. And part of that was because if you look back at the purple block here, the animistic and tribalistic, we were starting to discover in those ancient civilizations insights that our new science was only just starting to be able to get to grips with and understand. So this idea of a one unidirectional journey up the ladder, as it were, of increasing complexity gets a little stuck at that point. So I was wondering, well, how do you explain that then? How do you explain this civilizational innovation that there seemed to be many years ago back in the animistic and tribal civilizations? Now, the clarity came when I was doing some work with a dancer and choreographer called Dylan Newcomb, where he was putting dancers through a series of workshops and experimenting with 8 different sounds to see what their bodies did when they made those sounds. So he was trying to link sound to physical expression. And what he found is that a clear pattern emerged for these 8 different sounds related to the movements that these hundreds of dancers started to make. He then added an in and out breath to that. So you got a set of 16 kind of sound movements, as it were. And then at some point, somebody pointed him to the I Ching, and he noticed how the energy dynamics that he was discovering with his dancers matched almost exactly to the dynamics of the I Ching as described at the level of 8 and the level of 16. He then also noticed how the 8 was correlating, seemed to be correlating with the spiral dynamics model. And that's when he invited me in to help him with his research. And what we found was very interesting. It was that you had in the first 4 phases of development, each of those phases up until and including blue had a unique kind of dynamic to them. And the dancers each felt that they were a particular movement, as it were, in their own right. But then what happened at orange is that when they started to explore orange, it seemed to be like a mirror of the blue system, but with a slightly more subtle quality to it. So the same basic dynamic and the same basic movements, but more subtle in its nature. And then green seemed to be the same for red. So green was the similar basic pattern as that red system, but was more subtle. And the yellow for purple, and the turquoise for beige. So there was something that was showing a non-linearity, or let's say a cyclical relationship of some kind in the development of these value systems. And this is how he represented those energy dynamics using the yin and yang, essentially. So where you might in the I Ching, you have the lines, the full lines, and then the broken lines represent at 3, you can have 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, depending on how granular you go in the I Ching. So whether you go like 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc. And here he identified the core of the dynamics. And what you can see is that if you look at turquoise and at beige, it's the same basic patterns in a slightly different order, but you have the pure yin and the pure yang in 2 of the boxes. And you can see as you move into the middle, they actually mirror each other. What happens, interestingly, is that they become more refined as they move towards the center, and then they become, in a way, more archetypal or fundamental at the extremes. So that planted a seed in me to look at, okay, so maybe here there is a dynamic to explore, because the purple seems to be related to the yellow and the beige seems to be related to the turquoise. And our challenge as humanity right now is really to get into those integral and holistic levels of development at yellow and turquoise in order to be able to solve the kind of challenges that we're facing right now. But somehow those two value systems are related to the purple and the beige, those very early survival, precognitive value systems, precognitive ways of experiencing the world, the survivalist, the animistic, tribal experience. So this was another kind of next level of depicting it. Here, the circles represent the relationships between the different value systems. And at the top, the little table shows how, if you look at both purple and yellow, they are both about connection. Purple is about a tribal level of connection, you're in group, and yellow is about connecting everything up, connecting all the different aspects of reality. In red and green, it's about identity. Both of them are about identity, where red is very much about the me and the development of the ego identity, and in green, you want to belong to a collective identity. Blue and orange, they're about manifestation, where blue is about the order, being able to create the framework for things to manifest, and orange is about the growth in manifestation. And what you'll notice is those words internal and external there, where the beige and the turquoise, beige and the purple, those early systems, are internal in the sense that your foundation is an internal foundation, is on your inner experience, more of a yin-based system, you could say, which is similar to what happens when you come to the integral and holistic value systems at the top. They're also got a primarily internal focus. You're very aware of your own experience, conscious of how your own experience relates to and reflects the world around you. Whereas those four central systems, from the development of the ego, in fact, collectively from our feudal empires, through into the development of the religions and the nation states, the emergence of the market economy, and then into green, which is the kind of values-led communities, all have their focus and their starting point and the outside world. So not on the inside world, but the outside world. It's about expression of self. And that is the yang-based systems. So most of our development, in terms of particularly industrial development and the phases of our development that have created such pain in terms of our relationship to each other and our relationship to the planet, have come through those external systems. Now, in itself, a yang-based approach or an external-based approach is not a bad thing. So how come it seemed to become so unbalanced? How come those red, blue, orange, green systems weren't able to find a healthy expression of themselves, but found an expression of themselves that at the cost of others and the cost of other life? Whereas in their pure essence, like the red is about the expression of the self, that doesn't have to be at the cost of others. The blue is about finding your place in the world. Orange is about playing the game and improving and making progress. That doesn't have to be at the cost of the world. And green is about heartfelt connection to others. That doesn't have to include a kind of bitterness for people who don't believe the same thing as you. So what went wrong? And it was my quest into that led to the thesis around the pain and the promise. So, by the way, the chakras there, what we discovered when we were working with the dancers was that the chakras reflected the transition zones between these stages of development. So in a way, because they move energy, the chakras, they move the energy between these different stages of development. Interesting, of course, that the heart is right at the center of that. So the conclusion I came to was that in our collective development, as we moved from those first internal phases of beige and purple, which were precognitive, experiential phases of development. So we weren't sitting around and talking about our experience. It was a very felt and embodied experience of reality, into the next phase, which was the emergence of the ego in the kind of more psychological definition of the ego, which is the sense of separate self. So the realization that there is me and I'm unique, and there's an other and they're unique and they're different to me, as well as there being, of course, a fundamental connectedness. We start to notice distinction. That's the individuation process. Now, in that, if you go back to look at that phase of our collective human development, what you see is that the place that we come from, so that more tribal, pagan, animistic, earth-based, more feminine, we-based perspective on the world, started to be seen as a threat to the expression of the individual. Now, in a normal, healthy development, when you move from one stage to another stage, you do need to differentiate between where you were and where you're going to, and push away a little bit from that past so that you have the space to be able to grow into the next stage of development. But the problem comes when you don't just differentiate, but you actually disassociate. So you deny the identity of yourself in the past. You, in a way, deny your past self. And because it seems too threatening to the place you're trying to move to. And if you do that, if you transcend, and rather than transcend and include, or rather than expand and embrace, you transcend and repress or disassociate, then in individual development, that's what creates traumas in the past and all sorts of psychological problems in the future, because you've split off a part of yourself that isn't any more integrated in who you are. And that piece of yourself that you've split off will continue to pull at you and sabotage you to try to get your attention and ask you to reintegrate it, to honor the path you walk to get where you are now. Because at the moment, you're denying part of your journey by splitting yourself off from that past. So my thesis is that collectively in the West, to start with, we transcended and yet repressed that internal yin-based, earth-based, feminine phase of our development in our desire to break free as individuals and to create a way of seeing the world that put us in control of the wildness of the natural world, which is what we were part of and what we were experiencing ourselves as part of in those early stages. That was the time that we burned the witches. Anybody who had direct access to knowing, because that is what you had in those phases, because you were so plugged into life, you intuitively or instinctively knew what needed to be done. You were connected to the earth. And that, of course, became a threat to the new vertical authorities of the church, for example, who had created to get away from this material world because they'd repressed it, and so they were scared of it. To get away from the material world, put a god outside of the material world and set up a linear hierarchical model with God at the top and the priests next, and with a law in a way that you could only access God or the knowing of the esoteric through the church and the priests. So anybody else who was able to demonstrate that they were actually able to get direct access to some pretty cool knowing as well, like the witches, were at that, were a threat to that hierarchy, and so were burned or executed in other ways. Also, some of the other spiritual traditions around that time, like the Templars and the communities that were holding esoteric knowledge, that actually contradicted the church story, were also pushed underground, and many of them were were executed as well. So we have in our collective past a serious trauma of the split between who we are, who we think we are, and our real identity, which is that of being an expression of the earth, actually being the earth. You know, anybody from outer space who looked down at us would, when describing the earth, would describe humanity as part of the earth, as an expression of the earth. We've been given birth to by the earth. And when we repressed that, that cut us free in a way, unrooted us in such a way that we were able to do whatever we wanted to the earth for our own means, because we had repressed the knowing that we were actually part of her. And we'd also, when you repress that part of yourself, you are also repressing your sensitive side. And so we were able to do it without conscious emotional feelings of pain or injustice at what we were doing. So that, you know, if you think about that as a core trauma, that explains why we have been able to do what we've done to the earth, and why we've been able to do what we've done to each other. Because if you stop for any moment and think about it, it's crazy what we've done to the earth, because it's suicidal apart from anything else. And what we've done to each other. Why would one spend so much of one's existence creating pain for others and pain for the earth of which we're a part? It's actually our whole life support system. So it's not even a rational thing to do, let alone an emotionally intelligent thing to do. So there must be something there that explains why that has happened in that way. That isn't just a rational argument. And so my thesis is that when you come back to that shift that we made there, that was the moment when we, instead of transcending and pushing away from, but being able to remember and re-include that past identity of ourselves as the earth and fundamentally deeply interconnected, that we have lost our roots, lost our foundation, lost our place to rest, because that's what it gives you when you've got that integrated. You can rest again. And if there's anything that the people talk about at the moment that is the problem, it's stress, it's the speed, everybody trying to get more and more. And the whole materialism that has emerged is really an attempt, you know, to fill that hole in ourselves by getting more and more things out there, taking away our attention from what's going on in here. Because when we do direct our intention at that split and at that gap in ourselves, then there's an enormous amount of pain there. And so for us to be able to go there and engage and embrace that pain is an extremely courageous thing to do, and something that is not kind of accepted as the norm, I'd say, in the society. So the emotional intelligence, although obviously that is increasing in our societies now, is making it hard for us to actually get back and find out what is that pain there. Now, in order to be able to get access to the yellow and turquoise, which are the integral and holistic phases of development, it's my thesis that we need to heal our relationship to those earlier internal or yin-based systems. So this isn't just, we need to go back and heal our past. It's actually an existential urgency for us to do that, because it's only when we do that that we'll be able to release the yin-based intelligence from the next phases of our development, and that will enable us to effectively engage in these challenges. Because we can't just solve these challenges from a cognitive perspective. Cognition is very good at dividing, separating, identifying, going into detail. It's not good at sensing interconnectedness and interrelatedness. And it's not possible for the cognition to actually work with the subtle and informational realms which we desperately need to get back in touch with if we're going to be able to solve the challenges we're facing at the speed that we need to. So that's the core of the pain and the promise thesis, really, is that if we, in order to be able to access the promise of an integral and holistic way of being in the world that includes working with the invisible dimensions of reality that are just as real as the visible ones, and which are critical for us to be able to work with if we're going to be able to navigate as speedily as we need to through these current challenges, then we have to heal the pain to be able to access that promise. I want to share at the end a couple of the quotes that were really helped me feel that I was onto something with this thesis. And these are three now from Ken Wilber's book, Up from Eden, where he really describes very clearly this process that we went through. So he says the ego, in the necessary course of its emergence, so nobody's saying the ego in the sense of separate self is a bad thing. I mean, that is actually the earth becoming aware of itself, which is a beautiful development, becoming aware of itself through human beings. The ego, in the necessary course of its emergence, had to break free of the Great Mother. So he had to take that next step out of the purple phase. A feat represented in the hero myths. So if you look at all the hero myths, that's all about that kind of breakout and the individuation of the hero into their highest potential. But in its zeal to assert its independence, it not only transcended the Great Mother, which was desirable, but it repressed the Great Mother, which was disastrous. It is one thing to gain freedom from nature, emotions, instincts, and environment. It is quite another to alienate them. The Western ego did not just gain its freedom from the Great Mother. It severed its deep interconnectedness with her. And the image on the right you can see is, from one of our mythological stories where Zeus, who's a representation of the mental and the ego, defeats Typhon, who is the biological kind of nature embeddedness symbol. Now, linking back to this issue of linear time, because remember in beige and purple, when we were in a hunter-gatherer mode, we didn't experience time as linear. In fact, the linearity of time only emerged with the sense of separate self, which if you think about it is logical, because earlier we were experience everything as interconnected in that way. And then as we create the sense of separation and differentiation, we experience space between things, and to get from one thing to another requires time. So space in the sense of things being differentiated in that way, and time in the sense of linearity also emerged at that same moment. Abstract thought also emerged at that same moment, which in themselves are not bad things. But the problem is when they're seen as the only perspective on reality and forget the deeper context of interconnectedness that they actually emerged out of. So what Wilber does in this bit is he reflects on how that linear time and the development of the mind converge with the emergence of the ego and the impact that it has on our relationship to nature. So since nature or body is the referent of seasonal time, right? So nature, body, that's very much that beige purple phase. And there we experience the cyclical nature of time, seasonal time, coming back, going round again. So you've got that on the one hand. Since mind is the reference of historical time, so the emergence of mind with red and the linearity of time, the severance of the mind from the body meant a corresponding severance of history from nature. So this is really important. What happened when the ego emerged at Red is that the mind created a story that it was separate from the body and that it should rule and dominate the body in the same way that it should rule and dominate nature. And so what that did is that also, because the mind is focused on linearity, it cut the linear time from nature and from natural cycles. So it disconnected the sense of history from nature. So once the ego was cut loose from seasonal nature and from the body, it has no felt roots in which to ground its otherwise higher order awareness. So it's like the branches of the tree, shooting off upwards and cutting off their roots, because their roots go into that grubby earth down the bottom in the darkness that can't be seen. Whereas what these branches want to do is rise up towards the sun. Well, what's going to happen? That tree's going to start wobbling pretty soon and will eventually fall over, which is what's happening to our civilization. So at that point, when you've cut yourself off in that way, it seemed perfectly acceptable to the ego to begin a premeditated assault upon nature, regardless of the historical consequences of such activity, because history and nature were no longer integrated. So as we started to exploit the natural world, we didn't think about the impact that was going to have on nature over time, because we'd separated them from each other through the separation of mind and body, nature of history and nature. Likewise, the ego failed to comprehend that an attack upon nature was already an attack upon its own body, so that the whole project was, in the deepest and truest sense, finally suicidal. So the ego failed to realize, had forgotten that in the same way that the mind is in the body, that the human being is embedded in the earth. And that is why, of course, it's finally suicidal. And that's what we're facing right now, is the very challenge to human existence through things like climate change and all the challenges that it's going to bring with it, and the kind of health issues that we've seen with corona that have come out of a disregard for other life forms, if they come out of that abuse of animals, essentially. And he sums it up beautifully in this top line here. When the great mother is repressed, that purple beige, the great goddess is concealed. Great goddess is the access to the subtle realms. So we don't get access to that until we've reintegrated and healed our relationship with the great mother. And one may, it is a terrible realization, look in vain through Judeo-Christian Islamic religion for any authentic trace of the higher touch of the subtle goddess herself. In vain. She's not there. She doesn't feature in the stories. We cut ourselves off and denied the existence of that dimension of reality. And that would become a perfect and terrifying comment on an entire civilization. And unfortunately, because we were so unrooted and trying to grow crazily, we exported that whole mindset to the rest of the world. Now, in a global economic framework that glorifies that unlimited growth, completely unrooted in the context of who we are as the earth. And that is what's at the core of, I believe, our ecological, social, and healthcare challenges at the moment. There's another quote from David Abraham that beautifully kind of describes this. The conceptual separation of time and space, so the literate distinction between linear progressive time and homogeneous featureless space, functions to eclipse the enveloping earth from human awareness. So hides the context of the earth from our awareness. We see space as featureless, homogeneous, linear time, taking us away from things. As long as we structure our lives according to assumed parameters of a static space and a rectilinear time, we will be able to ignore or overlook our thorough dependence upon the earth around us. Only when space and time are reconciled into a single unified field of phenomena does the encompassing earth become evident once again in all its power and its depth, as the very ground and horizon of all our knowing. So there he's pointing to that yellow, turquoise, integral, holistic perspective when space and time are reconciled, which is what some of the new sciences are pointing to, into a unified field of phenomena. Then we reconnect to that experiential way of knowing that we had in the pre-rational hunter-gatherer times of existence. So just to finish with going into a little bit more detail in terms of how we experience reality in these three different phases. So currently, we see time as linear. We have past, present, future. We're all familiar with that. Our thought is abstract. It's mainly focused on things that have happened in the past and things that might happen in the future. So we spend most of our time thinking about stuff that's already happened or thinking about things that might happen, so not present with what's actually real now. Our language is a language of labels that abstracts and actually separates us from things. So when we name something, we kind of objectify it and, okay, that's categorized. So it's not, the language doesn't build a relationship between us and the thing, it labels and objectifies it. Whereas if you look back at some of the ancient languages, for example, I was looking into Old Irish and some of the Celtic languages originally, the way the language is structured and the nature of the words create a relationship between the speaker and the object. A very different kind of language than, let's say, the abstract scientific rational language that we're used to. More poetic, I guess, in its nature. And space, when we look around it, we kind of see stuff around us. We look at everything and we think, you know, well, it's just an object. In a way, it's dead matter around us. Well, we know from the new science that it's really, everything is actually very alive and moving. The things that we think are solid are full of little cells and things, atoms, you know, moving around. So nothing is as solid as the way we think it is. And yet that's the kind of way we've been brought up to believe our reality is there's this, this, and this. And then there's me is the most important. Now, in the kind of pre-rational phases, we experienced reality in a very different way. So we experienced time as cyclical in the natural seasons, non-linear, and very much about the present. So our senses were all about what can I pick up, you know, here and now, what's going on around me here and now. Our thought was direct and instinctual, so not abstract. Our thought was about the things that we were able to see and sense around us. Our language was very concrete in terms of it was about the things in our world, and it, as I just described, connects us to things. And we didn't talk about space in this way, but we experienced space around us as alive and deeply interconnected. That I was reminded the other day that if you look at the one of the Native American languages, in their language structure itself, they have no concept of past and future. In the very structure of the verbs, they're all ing verbs, doing verbs in the present, which tells you that when that language emerged, it emerged in a mindset that didn't have this concept of linear time in it. So what might happen to our experience of reality if we were able to re-engage and reintegrate the precognitive phases of development and unlock our potential in the transcognitive and transrational realms? Well, it's obviously hard to put into words, but to try to give us a feel for it. So our time is very much about being in the present, but holding an awareness of how things that have happened in the past are influencing the present, and also how the probabilities of things in the future are starting to form. But knowing that those are all an experience of the present moment. So there's a kind of continuous sense of presence, but an awareness of how the past and potential, past and future, are interacting. When Bohm and Krishnamurti were talking about time, they made a distinction between chronological time and psychological time. So they're not denying that there is a chronological time where you can see things evolve from, however many million years ago to the present. But psychological time is about how we relate to that reality. So do we psychologically allow ourselves to get caught up in the past and the possible future? And that, they say, is the problem. The question is about how we relate to the chronological time. And the problem, they say, is psychological time, where we lose ourselves in the present past and we lose ourselves in the future, and we basically disconnect from the present, which is the only thing that's actually real. Our thought, I think, would follow our intuition. So when you're fully present, you have a knowing about what needs to be done next. And then you can activate and use the mind to be able to understand, explain, work it out, do the things that need to be done. So the mind would be of service to the intuitive knowing. It wouldn't lead as it does now, but it would still be there as a very useful function that we've developed, because it helps us to work and engage with this material world. Language would be much more meaningful in the sense that it would be words would be filled with meaning. They would connect and help us resonate with each other and with other life forms as well. When I did my theater training in Paris in France many years ago, our director always said, look, if the audience falls asleep, it's your fault, because you have been mechanically repeating the words, the lines that you had to say. Whereas it's not so important what the word is, it's important what you fill the word with. And so when we come to language, it's about how we reintegrate the abstract or the cognitive language with the emotions, with the felt sense of things, so that they become alive again and don't become these dead abstract concepts. And our experience of space would, like in the precognitive, I do believe, be one of everything being interconnected again, which again is what the new science is telling us. But at the same time, acknowledge the differentiation and the beauty of the diversity between everything. So would honor the diversity of things in their differentiation, but would never forget their deep interconnectedness and relatedness, and would see everything as alive, would see the world around us as alive and as a kind of dynamic field of energy that's moving between all of these things, so that the boundaries of things don't stop at the physical skin that we can see, but expand out in more subtle fields of that being's reality, that then overlap and can interact with each other. And we'll learn more to be able to work consciously with those dimensions of reality. And when we do, that will massively accelerate our ability to be able to solve the challenges that we're facing at the moment. So that's my kind of sense of the pain and the promise. And that, as I say, this came out of my research into and conclusions about what I've called volution theory, which is what we'll be talking about in the next Merry Musing. But I believe there's a practice, there are practices that we can do that will enable us to heal this pain and unlock the promise that is there and just waiting for us. So more information, there's more Merry Musings on the Ubiquity University site. You can find out more about volution theory at volutiontheory.net or on my own website, petermerry.org. And Leading from the Field is the new book that actually tries to describe what it means to lead from this place of the promise, to lead ourselves and our organizations from the integral and holistic way of being in the world.